Well, good evening. Good evening. It is wonderful to see you all here tonight. Welcome. My name is Dr. Jessica Joustra, and I serve here at Redeemer as the director of our Wolters Center for Christian Scholarship, the host of our evening today. And I'm just so grateful that you all are here joining us today at Redeemer University for our second installment of our Wolters Center lecture series for the 2024-2025 academic year. This is our lecture, of course, in natural sciences and mathematics. So welcome. Here at Redeemer, we confidently proclaim that God's work in his world, in his original creation, in Jesus' life, in Jesus' death, in Jesus' resurrection, in God's ongoing and coming redemption and restoration is a comprehensive work. It's one that reaches every nook and cranny of his creation. It is, to use the words of a favorite theologian around here, Herman Bavinck, a joyful tiding, not only for the individual person, but for humanity, for the family, for society, for the state, for art, for science, for the entire cosmos, for the whole groaning creation. And these lectures are just one part of the work that the Wolters Center is doing in proclaiming and excavating and applying that good message of the joyful tiding of the gospel to all of creation. These lectures and our work in the center as a whole seek to faithfully steward the good gifts of the tradition upon which Redeemer stands, one that's been handed down from one generation to the next, and that has important insights for living faithfully in God's good created world. So in our work here, including in the work of these lectures, we want to excavate and explore the way that the gospel pulls us, calls us, fashions us, directs us towards God's will and God's way in his world. So we ask questions like, what does it look like to witness to the lordship of Jesus Christ and his coming kingdom in our scholarship and in our study? How do we affirm the ongoing good in God's world while rejecting the distortions and twisting of sin? How does our proclamation of who God is and how God created the world affect how we think about any and every discipline? One of the good gifts of the center is thoughtful Christian scholarship that seeks to answer these kinds of questions in and with all the disciplines of our university. We have in-house faithful teachers and scholars, including our natural sciences and mathematics fellow, Dr. Kevin Vandermeulen, who also, in this lecture series, join with leading scholars who are outside of Redeemer to help us think about central, vexing, difficult, complex questions. And so that's the work of these lectures, to drill down into particular disciplines and unpack some of the insights that a reformed approach to the questions and challenges of these disciplines can bring to the vexing, complicated questions of our day, with wonderful guides who can speak thoughtfully and insightfully to that joyful tiding of God's good creation and the gospel. And so with such a vision, it's my special privilege today to introduce you to our Wolters lecturers, a first for Redeemer to have two lecturers at the same time. In the natural sciences and mathematics, Dr. David Wolters and Dr. Matthew Heun. I'll introduce them one at a time and then a little bit of their joint work. Dr. Matthew Heun has taught engineering at Calvin University since 2002 in the mechanical engineering and EESE, for those of you that don't know that acronym, including me, energy, environment, and sustainability engineering concentrations. Prior to joining the faculty at Calvin, Matt worked for the Global Aerospace Corporation and NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Matt's driving research question is, what is the relationship among energy, materials, and the economy when viewed through the lens of sustainability? He's an author, co-author, and editor of books and dozens of journal articles and conference papers covering aerospace, energy, and sustainability topics. He's known for his innovative teaching and being a leader in the International Exergy Economics Research Network. And our second speaker is Dr. David Wolters, who's taught biology at Calvin University since 1997, working in the areas of plant evolution, field botany, and restoration ecology. Since 2009, Dave has been directing the Plaster Creek Stewards, a university-based watershed group focusing on restoring health and beauty to the highly urbanized and degraded Plaster Creek watershed. This work involves propagating native plants for community-based restoration projects, as well as ongoing research on stream microbes, flow dynamics, and the relative success of native species in novel urban ecosystems. Dave also co-directs the Emma Cole Project, a field-based initiative to revisit and botanically inventory all the sites that Emma Cole documented in her 1901 book, Flora of Grand Rapids. Together, Dave and Matt have edited a volume that this lecture builds upon, Beyond Stewardship, New Approaches to Creation Care. And they're very happy. I know many of you may have that book. Some of you have already read it. Some of you will eagerly anticipate reading it after today. And they are very welcome and happy to sign books as you'd like. And I will say, personally, I know too, as one of their former students, both of them, just how wise, inviting, and insightful both Dave and Matt are. And as one of the students in their first co-taught class together, what a dynamic and interdisciplinary team they are together to tackle these important questions. So Matt and Dave, we are so thrilled to welcome you. It's a special delight of mine as someone that got to know you as a student and now gets to invite you in this way as well, to welcome you here to Redeemer and to learn from you this evening. We've already had great experiences with them throughout the day. Looking forward to continuing it tonight. It's such a privilege to have both of you here with us to help think about one of these vexing challenges. How ought we properly steward care for God's good creation, honoring our God-given call to fill, keep, and tend the earth? How do we think about creation and our presence in it? Really important questions and wonderfully faithful guides. So please join me in welcoming Drs. Matthew Heun and Dave Warners for their lecture this evening, Beyond Stewardship, New Approaches to Creation Care.
Thank you, Jess, for the kind invitation. Thank you, all of you, for coming here tonight. Especially really happy to see so many students, some of whom I got to know at Osabo Institute. So this is a really wonderful evening for Matt and I. We also want to express our gratitude for the Wolters Center and the support of this lecture series. And just a personal thanks too for all the kindnesses that many people have shown to us since we arrived here last night, which seems like about a week ago already. Earlier this fall, after turning on the morning news, I heard a report that June, July, and August of 2024 was the hottest 3-month span ever recorded on Earth. In this span of 3 months positions 2024 to be the hottest year on record, replacing the previous hottest year, which was 2023. And 2024 shouldn't bask in the glory of its first place gold medal for long, because chances are it will melt to silver once 2025 has ended. That morning, I rode my bike to work, parked it in the bike rack with one other bike, all by themselves, while streams of cars were filing into the parking lot. I tried saying good morning to a colleague, but my voice was drowned out by 2 large riding mowers cutting the lawn. As I walked down the hall, past the recycling bin to my office, I noticed a colleague's wastebasket set out the previous night for trash pickup, and in it were several recyclable containers. Then I got my things together and went off to teach a beautifully diverse, eager group of freshman biology majors. Standing in front of them, I felt a pit in my stomach, envisioning the kind of future they're heading into. And I scrapped the devotion I'd prepared that morning and instead read from Romans 8. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. And I encourage them to be those children. My assessment is that our campus community at Calvin, and more broadly, we as a society in North America, haven't yet taken climate change and more broadly sustainability as seriously as we need to. And Matt and I share the opinion that part of the reason we haven't engaged in the level of creation care that this moment calls for is because the framework many of us have been taught for thinking about such things, Christian environmental stewardship, is not sufficient for these times. So maybe we need new ways of thinking, Maybe we need new ways of understanding the relationship between people and the rest of God's creation. Support for this statement I just made will be highlighted in 3 points, among many that Matt and I could make. So these are 3 evidences that we need some new ways of thinking. First of all, first line of evidence is illustrated in this graph. It's from 2015 U.S. Geological Survey, but it's still very appropriate for the point I want to make here. The blue line is human population growth. You've probably seen this before, right? Over time. So we keep growing exponentially. Starting to taper off a little bit, but we're still growing. The red line, stay here by the microphone. The red line is the rate of extinctions, species extinctions globally. That one hasn't started tapering off yet. Now, as a scientist, I feel like I have to say, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And yet I do think we'd be hard pressed to make a case that those 2 lines have no relationship to each other. And some more specifics. In 2018, a report came out of the United Kingdom that became dubbed the insect apocalypse, detailing large numbers of insects that have been in decline. So it's estimated that over the last century, between 5 and 10% of all species of insects on the planet, one of the most speciose groups of organisms on the planet, have gone extinct. And in many areas, it's been documented that upwards of 75 to 80% of the sheer number of insects have been lost just in the last 50 years. If you think, well, no, we don't have to worry about so many mosquitoes, or I never liked spiders anyway. Think a little harder, right? Insects are incredibly important components of any ecosystem, both in terms of pollination, as well as the way that they support upper levels of the food chain. And one case in point is a report that came out in 2019. Birds feed a lot on insects, and so it's not a big surprise if we've got a decline in insects that we're going to be seeing declines in birds as well. This estimate came out of Cornell University, where they have a big ornithology center, and they have estimated that in North America, we've lost 3 billion birds over the past 50 years. That's a decline of over 30%. So today, compared to 50 years ago, there's 30% fewer birds in North America. And that number, too, does not seem to be slowing down at all. And then also 2020, report came out, 2/3 of wildlife on the planet have been lost in the last 50 years. Another one of those upper layers of trophic level. So none of these trends are moving in a very good direction, and they're all reflecting that red line that I showed you that's tracking with human population growth. And I also want to point out, it's not absolutely necessary that when we have this many people, that they have to have this kind of impact on the rest of creation. We could choose to live differently. We could choose to take better care of the rest of creation. For the second and third lines of evidence, I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
So many of you may have seen this graph. I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate change story. And this first graph shows atmospheric CO2 concentration versus on the vertical axis versus time on the horizontal axis. Now, time here is thousands of years before the Common Era. The vertical line is today. You can see the big gap between today and the birth of Christ, 0. See that big gap there?
No.
Right. Smaller, 2,000 years is smaller than the width of my finger on this graph because it goes to 800,000 years ago. So you can see that today we have atmospheric CO2 concentrations that are beyond where we've ever had in the past. And there's a key number on here, which is 350. Let's go back one there. 350, which is the level beyond which we don't want to go because we're concerned about irreversible effects of climate change. Okay, so that's the atmospheric concentration of CO2 story. This is the global mean temperature story. And the effect of greenhouse gases building up in the atmosphere is that over time, the temperature on the Earth has gone up. This graph shows temperature anomaly, which is the difference between a temperature in any given month and the average temperature between 1850 and 1900. So we are now in some months going above 1.5 degrees C, 1.5 degrees C above that average temperature from more than 100 years ago. The red line, the trend line, is not quite there yet, but it's close. Now here again, 1.5 degrees C is a limit above which most scientists think that we'll have irreversible effects of climate change. So we are dangerously close to that limit. Third piece of information from the climate story, the second piece of evidence that Dave was talking about earlier. This shows how we got to that point. On the vertical axis, we have world CO2 emissions, and the units there are gigatons of CO2 per year. A gigaton is a lot of CO2. Officially, I'm telling you. And the horizontal axis is years from 1800 to roughly today. I put some vertical lines on here. You see all those vertical lines?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, can you tell what's happening in each of those vertical lines? There's a slight dip. I heard somebody say slight dip in CO2 emissions, right? You see that? Do you know what else happens in all those vertical line years?
Recession.
There's a recession. So a recession is the only evidence-based way that we know to reduce CO2 emissions. That's the world in which we live. Third piece of evidence. For this one, it helps to refer to the Belgic Confession. And there's an Article 2 in there, which is titled, "The Means by Which We Know God." We know God by two means, it says. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes like a beautiful book in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God. Beautiful and poetic. The second way is that God makes himself known to us more clearly by his holy and divine word, as much as we need in this life for God's glory and for our salvation. But I always like to think that it's the first one that tells us we know God by knowing the creation. So when we spoil the creation, we actually diminish our knowledge of the Creator and our ways to know the Creator. So three pieces of evidence, one from Dave's World of Biology, one from Energy and Climate, my world, and one from our Belgic Confession. One of the authors in the Beyond Stewardship project, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later, is Deborah Rienstra, and in a follow-up book to her work on Beyond Stewardship, she raises the question, where's the outrage? Where's the outrage? Why aren't more Christians sad or angry? Why aren't Christians the most outraged people on the planet over the destruction we have caused to the community of creation? Maybe it's time we hit the reset button. maybe it's time we hit the reset button on our understanding of the relationship between humans and the non-human creation. Now let's take a step back. I'd like to take a step back now and think about how we got here. How did we get to this point where human activity is really causing big problems? All right, now for this, I'm going to give you what I call hand-wavy church history from the Refugio Faith book, from Deborah Reinster's book. She admits that this is hand-wavy, so don't come at me if you don't like this. Okay, you can go at Deborah, but she's got broad enough shoulders, she'll be fine. Let's imagine that the universe is comprised of God, humans, and the non-human parts of creation. In the years before the early modern period, the focus of the church was on the doctrine of God and the nature of Christ and the Trinity, and the ecumenical creeds were developed in this time. From, say, year 500 to the Reformation, the focus was on the relationship between God and humans and the nature of salvation. Following the Renaissance and Reformation and the Enlightenment, the focus of the church was on relationships among humans. Now, I don't know about you, but it seems like my church remains stuck in this period. Talk about how we should relate to each other. And I'm not saying that's bad or wrong, it's just that's where we're at right now. But given the presence of human degradation on the non-human parts of the creation and the urgency of climate change, Rienstra argues that the relationship between humans and the non-human creation should be today's global interfaith theological project. And let's take a moment to look at the history of that relationship. For that, I'll hand it back to Dave.
So stewardship is kind of the paradigm. That's certainly how I was raised in the Christian Reformed Church. And I think the prevailing paradigm among many Reformed Christians when we think about creation care. Where did this come from? And how did Reformed Christians think about the relationship between people and the non-human creation before we started talking about stewardship? Here's a wonderful quote from John Calvin from the Institutes. He writes, "We cannot open our eyes without being made to see him, to see God. His nature is incomprehensible, far beyond all human thought, but his glory is etched on his creation so brightly, clearly, and gloriously that no one, however obtuse and illiterate, can plead ignorance as an excuse. The most perfect way of seeking God is for us to contemplate him in his works, whereby he renders himself near and familiar to us, and in some manner communicates himself. We ought to gaze upon his presence, or upon his works, that we may be restored by his goodness." And then Abraham Kuyper, "From of old, the church has pointed to nature and to the Bible as the sources of knowledge of God. The Reformed confession truly and beautifully declares that all creation is as a living book, the letters of which are the creatures. God himself is in and behind nature, and everything that lives in nature rustles, throbs, and stirs itself. We feel the pulse beat of God's own life. In nature also, everything is for the sake of religion, to reveal to us in it the glorious presence of God, to bring us the fostering sense that in nature everywhere, the living and almighty God is with us on every side, and to fill us with the sublime impression of his power, divinity, and majesty." Both of these Reformed leaders stress the immanence of God, God's presence in the creation all around us, and how the creation speaks to us and teaches us about God. Neither of them used the concept of stewardship. That came later. And in fact, it emerged here in North America after the Civil War, when church and state were separated, and the church had to raise its own funding and introduced the concept of the tithe. And with this focus on having parishioners contribute to the welfare of the institutional church came the concept of stewardship. That you provide the church with a portion of that which you earn. And that's the first use of the word stewardship in the Christian church. Post-World War II, when there was a fair bit of economic prosperity, the concept of stewardship in relationship to the church became expanded. And maybe you've heard this phrase, I definitely heard it growing up, that stewardship is about time, talent, and treasures, the 3 T's. And all of those you give back to the church. You have some time, so you invest it in the well-being of the community at your local church, your treasure and your talents, whatever gifts they are. And this was sort of the way people were thinking about stewardship until the late 1900s. And a significant shift occurred with the publication in 1967 of Lynn White Jr.'s article in the journal Science. And in this article, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, Lynn White Jr. really lays the blame for our environmental problems at the feet of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and said that the Judeo-Christian tradition of emphasizing dominion, of control over the creation, has led us into a dark alley of destruction of the non-human creation. Lynn White Jr. curiously was a Christian, and he was being very, very critical of the church and critical of the church to its core. It evoked a response. In 1980, funded by the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship, which is the same organization at Calvin that funded our project, the book Earthkeeping was published, where scholars came together and really made an argument and said, well, maybe Christendom is culpable, that the core teachings of Christianity do not lead us to wanton destruction of the creation. In fact, the core teachings of creation lead us to much more careful care of non-human creation. So Earthkeeping, Christian Stewardship of Natural Resources, was a very seminal, very important book, 1980. It was updated in 1991, and then notice the shift in title, Earthkeeping in the 90s, Stewardship of Creation. Right? So Earthkeeping, Christian Stewardship of Natural Resources. Natural resources are speaking to those parts of creation that have utility to humans. So the emphasis there was we need to take good care of the creation, or else we're going to be detrimentally affected, right? But they really moved away from that sense of let's just care for those useful parts and expanded it to all of creation. So as I mentioned, this was the paradigm I was steeped in as I was raised. And in my church, we sing these beautiful songs. Maybe you know some of them. The whole earth is filled with his glory. All thy works shall praise thy name. This is my Father's world. Beautiful hymns, right, that speak about the beauty of the creation. There's wonderful passages in Scripture. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Your works are wonderful, O Lord. I know that full well. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. I have these beautiful songs, these wonderful passages. And yet we just showed you those graphs and we reported on the extinction rates of different groups, right? Creation's groans persist and they're intensifying. So as a quote we had up earlier says, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. So if these are the results we're getting, maybe we need to take a good hard look at our system and make some systemic changes. So let me detail just 3 what we feel are limitations of the stewardship model. The book goes into more, but I want to highlight three here. First of all, a lot of this principle of stewardship, when it's written about, when we discuss it, refers to the parable, Jesus' parable of the vineyard, and the steward who takes care of the vineyard while the owner is away. And right as I said that, hopefully that should sound dissonant with the quotes from Calvin and Kuyper, who emphasize God's immanence in the creation. Right? As stewards of creation, are we taking care of something that belongs to someone else while they're gone? Calvin wouldn't agree with that. Kuyper wouldn't agree with that. God is present in the creation all around us. So I think that's one limitation. It de-emphasizes the presence of God in the creation. And as Matt was pointing out, by spoiling the creation, we are limiting the creation's ability to teach us about God, to draw us close to God. So that's one limitation. Another is just how this word gets confounded because it gets used in so many different words, with so many different other words. So if you just do one of these word maps in Google for stewardship, this is what came up. And you see talent there, giving, sharing, there's time, there's treasure, the three T's, right? But you have to almost do a Where's Waldo to find creation, right? It's way down over here. So a lot of times you have conversations and you're trying to convince people we need to be better stewards. And you might be talking about stewards of creation and they might be thinking about stewards of their bank account, right? The word gets used in so many different words, time, talent, and treasure. It gets used in so many different words. There can be lots of crosstalk. So I think it has limited utility because of that. Just one example, when I first started teaching at Calvin, we have this preserve, part of our campus, a wonderful natural area. And part of the preserve was being looked at by administrators to put a new building into. And it had been set aside with the mission statement that this is going to be held in perpetuity as a testimony to God's goodness and grace. And the administrators were saying, we're wasting that land by not developing. We're not being good stewards of the land because we're not developing it. And so that was really sort of hit me in the face that this word is limited in the way we can use it because we often don't know what we're talking about. And then a third way, stewardship oftentimes is referred to as it's our responsibility to care for the creation. And it can seem almost like a duty. But for those of you who like to spend a lot of time in creation, I'm sure you could testify that there's so much joy there. And I think we really need to do a better job of cultivating love for the world around us. And I don't think stewardship leads us in that direction because it seems so much like it's a responsibility. So the person who wrote the foreword in our book, Bill McKibben, who's an environmental activist, really summarized this point well, I think, when he wrote, as the authors of this book point out, stewardship is a limited idea suggesting at best a dutiful sense of earnest commitment. For some reason, the word always gives me the nagging sense that it's time again to mow the lawn. It is not particularly joyful. It misses the gospel call to love. Oh, and beyond that, it clearly isn't working.
So as Dave and I and others on our campus and beyond we're having these conversations for a decade or more, we wondered if it's really time to move beyond stewardship. So we embarked upon a process that brought a bunch of authors together, and land ended up with an output of the book that we're here to talk about today, and that some of you have been reading and engaging with over the last few months. And we're really grateful and humbled, actually, that you're doing that. We really appreciate it, and we hope it's been a wonderful experience for you to be in there and looking at that. But what I want to do today is bring out a little bit of the process that we use to write the book, to develop the book, and then Dave will talk a little bit more about some of the contents of it. So we'll take a little break here to talk about the process that we used and get to the contents of it. What Dave and I did is we invited 13 authors in addition to ourselves to 2 workshops at the beginning and the end of the summer. And you could see the authors on here. These are thoughtful and wise people who we have known over the years in our teaching and in our academic and research endeavors. They were all or are all active in creation care and sustainability activities. You'll notice as they come up here that the authors come from a wide variety of disciplines. So there's geography, economics, English, theology, and ecology, and communication just across the middle row there. So interdisciplinary group of people who are all interested in these issues, but they're all reformed in their outlook on life and on the creation. Like I said, we held 2 3-day workshops on either side of the summer, and that it was fascinating to see the differences and commonalities among the authors that provided stimulating discussions and just great interactions, fabulous interactions. It was really important for us to be interdisciplinary in this project because the ecological and climate problems that we're facing are in fact interdisciplinary problems, and we need all hands on deck to start to address them. We also invited 3 observers to these workshops. These observers provided active listening feedback, and they interacted with the authors and the editors, both in groups and individually, as we went through the weeks, or the workshops, I should say. We also did what we called morning work. And this is something that I learned from my time on sabbatical in South Africa a few years ago. We got everybody together, and one day we went into the greenhouse and we planted seedlings. Another day we did buckthorn removal. Buckthorn is an invasive species in West Michigan, and we...
And Ontario.
Thank you. Yeah, so we hacked down a whole bunch of stands of buckthorn and painted them with Roundup, right? So never again, I'm saying to them. We planted seedlings out in other areas of the campus to grow later. But these events, these times we spent, what, it was an hour or so in the morning, morning work. They were opportunities for socializing, but they were also opportunities to discuss chapters and ideas that were forming amongst the authors. We tried our best to create a comfortable environment where it was safe to be vulnerable and build trust with other potential authors. We also did a exercise that we called Stories in the Round. Each chapter in the book starts, we required that each chapter in the book start with a story, an engaging story that draws the readers in. And there are some really fascinating, interesting stories that come from the personal experience of each of the authors. Now, those stories didn't just come out of nowhere. We asked each author to start with their story, but started with a germ of an idea usually. And we asked the authors to stand by an easel and draw their story. They couldn't use any words. But then they would tell their story to the other authors. And there's one of the observers there next to Kyle and Deborah, so we had to tell the story. And what would we give them, like 2 minutes or something like that? Just like go, go, go. Then the next author would swing by and they'd they'd flip the thing over and they'd tell the story again. They'd redraw it and then they'd tell the story again and redraw it over and over and over. They told the story in 2-minute segments until they refined their story. They figured out what landed and what didn't land with the observers and their other stories. And they refined what resonated with everybody else. So, and we did this, so, you know, by the time we did this course, everybody's gone around and heard everybody else's story. So now we're enforcing in a good way, positive way, interaction amongst the authors before they even write a word of their chapter. We also asked the authors to arrange themselves in the order that they thought their chapters should appear in the book. And this turned out to be a nice team photograph of everyone, actually. That's not the order that they're in, actually, just so you know. We changed it up a little bit, but it was a fun little exercise. And we intentionally, because you can see there's a lot of interaction here, we intentionally sought connections among the chapters. And the observers really helped with this. We see here is essentially a napkin drawing of connections that we thought we saw between the chapters, and showing the links among them. We actually notate this in the manuscript by, in many places, saying, see Baumel Prediker chapter 6, or see Grunendijk chapter 2 and Rienstra chapter 8. So you can see the connections that we were all making at the time. So this is really a different kind of an edited book. It's not an edited book where we gave authors assignments and they sent us back a thing and we put them a chapter and we put them all together. It's really not a collection of standalone chapters. It's an organic whole that emerged from these workshops with a lot of interconnections, informed by the personal and intellectual relationships among the authors. So hopefully if you read the book, you will see some of that stuff. All right, so that gives you an idea of how we arrived at this product. And I think Dave's now going to take over and talk a little bit more about some of the themes that are in the book.
So this is not a book where we introduce the brand new paradigm for thinking about creation care, right? Not stewardship, so now what? Instead, this is a book that just opens up possibilities and provides lots of different ideas. And it's really a book where we're trying things out. And we found that certain themes really connect with certain people and other themes really connect with other people. That came out just in our faculty discussion this afternoon. But at the same time, as Matt was saying, we saw lots of connections and there were some themes that really emerged. And I just want to highlight 4 of those now. Matt leads off the first chapter with an allegory set at the Calvin Engineering Open House in May of each year. He uses a hypothetical speech to students and parents to ask how the engineering students would feel if he had destroyed their prototypes that they'd worked hard on all semester with his personal sledgehammer the night before their public presentations. That allegory leads to a discussion of lament. Lament by the prototype standing in for creation, because they now cannot do the function that they were designed to do. Also the lament of the students who had worked so hard and taken such delight in bringing those prototypes into existence. And then also lament of the destroyer, who after he's done with his fun and his sledgehammer, realizes, oh no, what did I just do? So that destroyer then stands in for those of us who have been involved in destruction, which is all of us, of the creation. Matt's point here is that in order to move forward in a really inspired and hopeful direction, we have to come to terms with the destruction that we have caused. We have to realize that we're complicit. Our hands are dirty. We're part of the problem. We don't stay there, but we need to get there. And once we're there, then it will provide really powerful inspiration. But we're trying to make things right again. So lament is one important theme that emerges from different chapters in this book. Matt writes, we sit between the way the creation is, which is damaged, and the way the creation ought to be, which is flourishing, and we don't know what to do. Beyond Stewardship is a book for Christians who are distraught by the lament of the maker and compelled by the lament of the creation. It is for those who recognize their role as a destroyer and find themselves on a path through lament to forgiveness, improved relationships, and recommitment to repair the damage they have done in the past and to do less harm in the future. Amina El-Attas Bradford uses microbes to encourage a sense of humility, which is a much better posture for creation care than dominion. Humility reduces our tendency to objectify the non-human creation, to think of it as something other, something out there, something it. She uses microbes and the human biome to decenter humanity. She writes, discoveries of humanity's intimate entanglement with microbial life complicates the theological idea that we are somehow separate from and superior to the rest of creation. How superior to animals can we be if we depend on them to be ourselves? When we understand that matter matters for redemption, caring for the creation becomes a mutual stewardship, wherein we acknowledge that the flesh that supports our biological and spiritual renewal needs us to return the favor. We must move beyond mere stewardship to symbiotic stewardship as we embrace our creaturely dependence. So this sense that we are a part of the creation comes up over and over in different chapters as well. We're embedded creatures, right? We're not somehow positioned outside of the creation. We are part of it. And the third theme is kinship. Kyle Maynard Scott tells the story of Larry Gibson. And that's the story that he was illustrating in the earlier picture that Matt showed. Larry Gibson lives in West Virginia on Caford Mountain. And he opposed mountaintop removal mining for coal in West Virginia, protected his family home for decades. Kyle names that radical connection, that radical commitment that Larry had between humans and the non-human creation as kinship. And he writes, Scripture does not ultimately call us to use and manage the creation. Rather, it calls us to be in intimate kinship with it. Matthew Halteman and Megan Halteman-Swart in their chapter really take on this concept of kinship as well. They write, God's human and non-human creatures fundamentally belong together. The strong bond that unites them is more like a loving family relationship than an instrumental relationship between a steward and a resource. The word kinship captures the nature of this bond. And then a fourth theme, environmental racism. Gail Gunst-Hefner leads her chapter with a story of surprise at seeing an African-American grandfather and grandson fishing in Plaster Creek, which is the most contaminated waterway in West Michigan. The story brings us into recognition of environmental racism and confronts us with what must be done. She writes, first, all people must recognize the reality of environmental racism. Next, privileged people must develop empathy for and learn from the people most affected by environmental injustice. Then privileged people must admit and lament complicity in the formation and perpetuation of environmental injustice. Finally, restorative action must occur. There's other themes as well. So this slide, we just quick enumerate a few of them. Kathy Grunendijk emphasizes that audience matters and words matter. And what words you use with which audiences are really, really important. Sometimes maybe certain audiences, stewardship is still the best word to use. Clarice Joldersma and Steve Baumer-Prediger really like the concept of earth keeping and refer to human beings as earthlings who are in charge with earth keeping. Jamie Skillen points to shalom and says that our actions here on earth really needs to be focused and pointing towards shalom as we interact with the broader creation. And he refers to this as eschatological stewardship. Deborah Riester talks about how names matter, the importance of learning the names of plants like buckthorn and plants like black-eyed Susan that we saw this afternoon on a walk. Once you know the names of something, that starts a relationship. If you don't even know their names, it's really hard to have a meaningful relationship. Dietrich Baumra asks the question, who gets to be a steward? Who has the agency? Who is capable of making decisions that will impact the way we interact with the creation? So many people in the global planet don't have that kind of agency, and we need to acknowledge that and lament it and work to get them more agency. Mark Bjelland is an urban geographer And he talks about how stewardship, we really should talk about it as placemaking, because he feels like his area of study, urban spaces, never get talked about when we talk about stewardship. People are thinking about being out there in quote unquote nature. So he really likes the idea of placemaking better. And then I highlight the indigenous Ottawa notion that we live in a world filled with gifts, gifts from the Great Spirit. And if we think about the creation as filled with gifts, and then think about how we interact with gifts in our own lives, it will lead us to different postures and different actions in the creation. I'll be talking more about that at the chapel tomorrow. So just to give you a little bit of flavor, maybe we've revealed too much. Now you feel like you don't need to read the book. But hopefully we've enticed you enough to pick up the book and have a read.
So a little bit more about the book and the way it's structured and what's in it and resources that you can use and appreciate as you read it. So resources for the book. First one is we have discussion questions in the back of the book in an appendix that could be used for small or larger group discussion sessions. Hopefully you can find these generative for your conversations about the themes that are in the book. Second, we have an online companion website for the book that features, that illustrates each chapter, and they feature photographs and other images that are selected by the authors and pull quotes from the chapters. This provides a visual way to visualize some of the things that the authors are talking about in their chapters. I think this is Dietrich Bauma's chapter, where he was talking about the agency and who gets to be a steward, and he talks about tea plantations in India, and here's one of his photos that's on the website for that. And finally, I think this might be my favorite piece of this. We've got a podcast. We built a podcast. That's a medium that I really enjoy. I really like. Maybe some of you do as well. David and I each interviewed 6 authors. So he did 6 and I did 6. And we also interviewed each other. And we have each of those interviews is an episode of the podcast. We also recorded an introductory episode. In those episodes, we discuss the chapters and the author's motivation. Why did they write the chapter the way they did? We also ask authors to read their own work. I love that when I'm listening to a program and I can hear the author read their own work. So that's really, really pretty cool. The podcast is hosted on Anchor, but if you search for Beyond Stewardship in any podcast client, you'll come up with it. You can listen to those things. Finally, all these resources can be found on the website for the book, beyondstewardship.com. If you go there, you can see those things. I think it would be best to end with a few acknowledgments. Although David and I are the ones speaking here, a project like this is really only possible with the involvement of support of so many people. A fun fact here is those authors that we showed you there, we had 100% retention of authors who arrived on the first day and actually submitted a chapter and made it into the book. So we're really proud of them, and it's all credit to them for their commitment to the whole process that we put together. It's really gratifying to see their good work. A few other people involved here. We had an intern, Janice, who really helped with a ton of logistics, companion website, discussion questions, etc. And Susan Felch was the executive editor at Calvin Press, and she really helped the book come together and guided us through the process of guiding the authors through their processes. Yeah, sorry. Made it harder on us. Thank you. It was going right here. So then we got some funding from the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship, as David mentioned before, the provost and the dean for faculty development, without whom this would have been impossible. Biology department had a seminar series where we invited the authors of the chapters to come and speak there as well. So we would be very happy to answer questions and have discussion now, especially questions that maybe students would have. But I just want to say thank you so much for being here and for taking your time, spending your time with us tonight. It is a real joy and pleasure to see you all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt and Dave, for helping us begin to think through a lot of these questions about creation care, stewardship, beyond stewardship, the problem, how we've gotten here, what we ought to do, how we can kind of envision, faithfully re-envision our place and our understanding of what it means to be creatures in God's good creation. So we do have time for questions. Any that are, there's a feast of ideas here, questions that begin to immediately come to mind. Wonderful, we have a couple. We'll begin back here.
There's a number of points in the presentation where you talk about how misinterpreted parts of scripture in terms of our calling for dominion over creation, exploit creation, which really resonates with me, but I'd love to hear some one of you speak from scripture to that, to talk about how in scripture we're misinterpreting that. It's a lot of what was presented there. The concepts make sense, but how do we interpret those passages? How do we interpret what we've long understood?
Yeah, wonderful. So the question is, you've talked a lot about dominion, how that's been misinterpreted. Can you speak from scripture to help us understand how we rightly understand those verses and beyond, to get a right understanding of our relationship in creation?
I'll take a stab first. You're asking your question. What came to my mind was the word rule in Genesis 1:26 or 28, one of those two, where Adam is told to rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. One point I want to make about that is the birds of the air and the fish in the sea in Genesis 1:20 were commanded to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. And so when Adam is told to rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, he's basically being told, make sure those creatures can do what God commanded them to do, which is to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. But also that Hebrew word rule is radah, R-A-D-A-H. And it's used throughout the Old Testament. And it's used to depict the rulers, right, the kings. And a good radah was a king who ruled in a way that the subjects flourished, that the people were thriving when that king was ruling. So when God tells Adam to be a rada'er of the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, God is telling Adam, make sure that these creatures can thrive. Be a good ruler, right? And I think we've taken that, hey, we're in charge. When we're in charge, we can do whatever we want. But that is not at all the intent of that Hebrew teaching of Radah. So that's one thought that came to my mind. And then, of course, Genesis 2:15 balances Radah and Kabash, which come up in the first chapter of Genesis. Kabash is to subdue. But then in Genesis 2:15, Adam is told to tend and to keep, or to serve and to preserve the creation. And I think a full understanding of our role needs to incorporate all four of those in their proper meanings. Add anything?
No, I was going to talk about Genesis 2, so already covered.
Okay.
All set.
Thanks for the question.
What a team, reading each other's minds. Fantastic. I saw another hand, Jonathan.
Sure. Thank you very much. This was a wonderful kind of presentation, and I intend to buy the book when we're done. So I hope that encourages. My question is about, given the desire for new language, and I'm an English professor, so I'm always interested in questions of nomenclature and the like. The focus here is on a Christian approach to these things. Given the kind of startling facts that you presented at the beginning, this is something that needs to happen continentally, globally. How do we go about doing that? It's one thing for us to change, but what does it mean for the whole world to change the way that we see this?
Yeah, so question is, this is a big problem. And
Vexing question, as you reiterate.
And it is indeed a big problem for Christians, but not simply a big problem for Christians. It's a global problem. What do we do?
I'll go first this time. a word that we are starting to use at Calvin, or have been using for a while at Calvin, to talk about these sort of big problems that are interdisciplinary. Potentially they're tractable. We could see a way to solve it, but they're really hard. And when do we get started, and how do we get everybody on board? Those kind of problems. You've heard of those ones?
Oh, yeah.
We call those grand challenges. That's that, you know, your English professor, those are the words we're using to describe these things. And we didn't come up with that term. It's a term that's out there. People are talking about grand challenges. Another phrase that people use to talk about this are wicked problems. I don't like that one, but I understand the reason behind
There's
it.
a New England feel to
It
it.
sure does, yeah. Halloween feel suddenly. And these grand challenges are extremely difficult to work on. There are a couple things that I think about when we are trying to tackle grand challenges. First thing to say is that it's an all hands on deck situation. We need everybody involved. No matter what your discipline, no matter what your career, there is something that you can contribute to working on and potentially solving these problems. So I teach engineers, David teaches biologists, Jessica was in biology and then went to seminary and is now a theologian. I mean, all hands on deck. We need everybody involved. The second thing to say about how we work, so that means that Christians are going to have to be both willing and able to work with non-Christians and people of other faiths. It's just a fact. If we're going to tackle these problems, we're going to have to do that. So that means we maybe need to, some of us maybe need to develop skills to be able to do that well. Second aspect of these kinds of big problems is that we almost by definition don't know what the answer is. So we're probably going to need to be trying lots of things, experimenting, throwing the spaghetti on the wall and seeing what sticks, kind of an idea. It's almost from the world of business, the idea of you create a lot of startups, a lot of firms, you have creative destruction, and you see which ones are successful. Deborah Reenstra's book, Refugia of Faith, whose cover I put up here a little bit earlier, she was one of our authors, and she borrows the term refugia from biology. Refugia is a place, it can be oftentimes very small, that is the refuge for life after some kind of big disaster. So Mount St. Helens blows up, but there are these small pockets, refugia, where we see life reemerging in this landscape that's been destroyed. So that's a second piece to how do we actually tackle this stuff? Well, we've got to try lots of things, discard what doesn't work quickly, and move forward using the best things that we find. And we have to be able to work well with non-Christians because it's all hands on deck. So the book here was really focused on, coming at this from a Christian point of view and speaking to Christians because, well, that's the world that we live in. And I think there's important needs there too, but that's not the end of the story. Sorry, there's a lot more that we need to do as well. So, do you want to say anything more about that, David?
Maybe I love Matt's answer. I find myself a lot of times, especially talking to young people, emphasizing that we need a new paradigm, kind of like we talked about here. So we need a new paradigm, not just within the church, but we need a new global paradigm for how to interact and what's proper behavior and what's improper behavior. And if we keep doing status quo stuff, you saw the graphs, right? We're headed in bad direction. So we need really fundamental changes in the way we do agriculture, in the way we do transportation, in the way we build buildings, in the way we have cities, pick any of the above and find a place where you can make your contributions to a new paradigm. And it actually can be quite exciting when you get into some of these new ways of living and new ways of thinking. My daughter just bought a tiny house. That's a new paradigm for sure, right? And she's all about living with as little as possible because she's really worried about the future. And I love that. I absolutely love it. Maybe I won't love it when we go visit her. I love that. You know, signs, prophetic signs, that we don't have to keep doing things the same way. We can figure out new ways to do things so that we aren't such a scourge on the planet. So thinking in terms of paradigms and what does that new paradigm look like, I think can be helpful too.
Well, wonderful. I see a lot of hands, but I know first we have a follow-up from Edward, Dr. Berkelar.
Just, so a quick follow-up is, I think, when these problems can seem so big and overwhelming, that part of the calling is to simply be faithful and let the chips fall, and to not, because I think part of it is the grand scheme of partnerships and tackling, these massive problems, but I think there's a calling for just faithful living too, and letting God use what he will use of that.
Yeah, wonderful, a good word.
Can I follow up?
Absolutely.
I love that you said that, Edward, because that's one of the things that I also use with my students. And in fact, what's fascinating is the Christian faith has that already built into it, right? We're not faithful. We don't do the right things necessarily because we know it's going to bring good things to us. We do the right thing. We try to be faithful because we're supposed to be faithful and we're supposed to do the right things. There's an old saying that I think is attributed to Abraham Lincoln, but it goes something like, we are not called to be successful, we are called to be faithful. And it's true. And this is something that maybe some of the students here will resonate with as well. It's something that I resonate with. That is that no one individual in this room, if they do the tiny house, if they do the native plantings, if they do the electric vehicle or whatever, it's not going to solve the problem. The problem is way too big. But that's something to lament first. Just sit down and cry that you can't solve the problem. That's okay. But then you say, all right, I still need to be faithful. And what does that look like? Where I am, find something that you're good at, do that in the direction of trying to be more sustainable, and just be faithful. Those are the key pieces. Okay, that was my follow-up to the follow-up, and thank you for reminding us that. It was great.
Wonderful question in the back.
Yeah, I have a similar question, a bit more specific. So the Oxford Dictionary has a shorter dictionary called the Oxford Children's Dictionary, which has a list of words that are used regularly by British children. And there's a bunch of news a few years ago about a lot of nature words being removed, like acorn, fern, wren, goldfinch, because 8-year-olds just aren't using those words. They're not important to their lives anymore. They're replaced with digital words. My question is, a lot of people are, like the global trends, more people living in cities, everyone lives in the digital landscape. How do we convince people at scale to care at a heart level about something that's not just an important part of their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, so the question is, looking at an Oxford Children's Dictionary that is taking out words like acorn and wren and goldfinch and replacing them with digital words that reflect the reality of these children today. What does it look like to help convince people to care in this world, in this context?
Thanks a lot for the question. It's a challenge. It's a really big challenge. What does it look like? My freshman biology students, I give them 4 assignments in the fall semester that they have to go out into our ecosystem reserve and find a place to sit down without their phone for 30 minutes and then come back and reflect on it. Right? I'm trying to nurture a relationship between them and the non-human creation. It's really been interesting. I did it the first time with some fear and trembling last fall. And at the end of the semester, I asked them to be honest and tell me what they thought. And 78 out of 79 students thanked me for the assignment. And they said the first time there were mosquitoes that got bit up and they hated it. But by the 4th time, they were really looking forward. They have to go back to the same spot and tell me how it's changed and how they've changed, because now it's later in the semester, that sort of thing. And I had one student email me this fall saying she's in grad school now, and she's just wanted to let me know that she's incorporated that into her fall rhythm now, where she found a place at her grad school where she does the same thing. So these are little tiny things. This is not a magic bullet, just do this and everything's going to be great. But I do think it is helpful to reflect on the relationship that's been so damaged between people and the earth, and do whatever we can to start to mend that relationship and grow it back again. So I know a lot of these students are not procreating yet, but when you get around to procreating, man, get your kids outdoors, you know, just whatever, just get them outdoors, spend lots of time with them outdoors, and older people with your grandkids, you know, and I'm probably preaching to the choir. You probably guys all do that already, but nurture that relationship and strengthen that relationship, and do it with yourself too. Right? All of us, we're better people when we spend time outdoors. So I think that's one thing that comes to my mind. Yeah, I'll stop there. There was something else, but maybe I'll think of it when Matt's talking.
I'll probably tell you what you were thinking. Just a second. No, I think I really appreciate the question. It's a great question. And I'm really appreciative that you zoomed in on the idea of words, and if I can extend that to the idea of names for things. I think David mentioned that Deborah Reenstra's chapter talks about names and how names are a key to unlock knowledge, because if we don't have names for something, we can't even, if we don't have names, we can't talk about it. But you know, the other thing we can't do is we can't think about it. So names are super important. So I think it's a travesty that some of those words are being lost from the children's dictionary, and making sure that we understand the names of things is really an important thing for us to do as well. I think it's a good reminder for everybody to be doing that. So thanks for that great observation. That's really, really helpful. Now you remembered it. There you go.
We had a student, I don't know if you guys do that here at Redeemer, but when freshmen start in the fall semester, we have what's called Street Fest. And as part of their orientation, they did take half a day and they have to volunteer with a local organization. And they do this in groups. So the watershed group that I direct is called Plaster Creek Stewards, and we host different groups at different project sites along the creek. And we had a student who joined in one of those groups, and she literally did not know how to use a shovel. She had never planted a plant before in her life. She was raised in a high rise in a very big city. And to see the delight after the plant, she got the green side up, that was good, the brown side down, you know, but to see her delight was amazing. And it reminded me the work that we do, we're really trying to engage the community. And so all the projects we do, we get as many community people there as possible. Old people, young people, little kids, you know, middle-aged, whatever. Let's all come together and plant a bunch of trees and show how much we care about this creek. And what we've seen is that I think generally we think about ethics, and then if we get our ethics right, then it will affect our praxis and we'll behave properly. But what we've seen is that it can go the other way too. That if you give people opportunity to practice and do the praxis stuff, then it'll change the way they think and change the way that they understand what's right and what's wrong. So I think, again, this is sort of reflecting back on my emphasis to get outdoors and get other people outdoors. But if you engage in the creation care work, it will help you think better about creation care. So don't always think you have to lead with the ethics. You can lead with the praxis sometime, and then the ethics will percolate out.
Yeah, I guess kind of touching again on the global aspect of this. In what ways do you think this project or creation care generally can connect the church globally? How can it be a uniting force, and how can we as Christians, particularly in North America, draw on, I guess, the riches and thinking of other Christians elsewhere? Maybe how has that happened in your own project, or have you seen that done well?
Yeah, wonderful. So the question is, acknowledging this is a global project, and then acknowledging we are part of a global church. What are the relationships that you've seen? Are they strengthened? How are they working together? How can this kind of bring Christians from all over the globe together? What are the things we can learn from Christians in other parts of the globe? Have you seen this happen? And maybe even what are your hopes for it as you reflect on that?
I'm on the nascent creation care team at our church, and one of the things that we are suggesting as a way for our church to become more involved in such things is to celebrate the season of creation. I don't know how many of you are aware of that, but you can go, there's a season of creation website, just search for it, you can find it. Churches worldwide are taking the month of September to celebrate and incorporate into worship and liturgy elements of creation and the interconnectedness that we humans have with the non-human parts of creation. To me, it's always very meaningful when we have Worldwide Communion Sunday to know that you're connected to churches elsewhere in the world. And I guess you asked about hopes, and I think one of my hopes would be that would be a way that churches worldwide could incorporate understanding of creation care issues into worship is by celebrating that season. So it doesn't solve problems necessarily, but it does raise awareness and it makes you feel connected to the global church. That's one idea.
I think there's really wonderful opportunity here for interfaith dialogue and interfaith learning, because the watershed work I do, we have a whole bunch of people who live in this watershed and they come from all different walks of life. And we have, we have a temple in the watershed. We have a lot of Christian Reformed churches in the watershed. We have a mosque in the watershed. And we have a lot of people who don't profess a faith in a major religion. But we all share the same watershed, and we're all impacted by this incredibly polluted stream that's coming through the middle of the watershed. And so it gives us an opportunity to recognize our commonality and come together and listen to voices from other faith traditions about what motivates them to care for the creation. And no single religion has it all figured out, but we can all learn from each other, including indigenous spirituality. I think it's really important to recognize that here in this landscape in North America, there were people living here for many centuries and they didn't destroy the place where they lived, right? And maybe there's something we could learn from them as we try to forge that part of our future where we don't destroy the place where we live. So how do they think about their relationship to the creation? And what resonates with biblical teachings? Because a lot of it does. And maybe there's some new things we need to learn as well. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to sort of set down our guardrails on our own faith tradition and open up to others, because we all are in this together, as Matt said, all hands on deck. And so it can bring really wonderful and exciting new insights and partnerships.
So I wonder, as folks think of questions, we have time for a couple more. I wonder, I imagine many in this room are thinking, yes, I have been long convinced that creation care is an important part of my Christian discipleship. This gives me new categories to think in, new ideas to imagine. But I wonder what you would say to someone that might say, oh, wow, I've not actually thought much about this before. And I see these charts, I hear these stories. There's something here. I want to do something. I have no idea what. So it's not even a question of the immensity of the challenge, which we've talked about a bit, but a question of simply what might be first steps if, someone that we're talking to, or maybe someone in this room is saying, what does it look like to approach creation care? What would you say?
I'm going first on this one. All right. Thank you. That's a fantastic question, and it can be answered in so many ways. I point you to a resource, first of all. There's a great, again, follow-up book by one of the authors in Beyond Stewardship, Kyle Maillard-Scott, who wrote a book entitled Following Jesus in a Warming World. So Kyle was the National Director of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action for many years, until he aged out of the position, literally. They kicked him out because he was too old. Fantastic person and a really great thinker on these issues. So I would point you to that resource, number one. Number two, I would say, think about, then I guess number two would be educate yourself. Part of that would be reading Kyle's book and just learning about some of the information that we were sharing today and learn more about it for yourself. Three, then find out what you're good at. Think about what you are good at. And then think, how can that be turned toward doing right by the non-human parts of the creation. So David, pretty great at biology, and was concerned about the condition of the creek after he and some students took measurements of it. Measured E. coli levels, et cetera, et cetera. So he's like, okay, I'm pretty good at this. Let's see if we can get some people together and care for our watershed in a better way. I'm kind of a good engineer and I know a lot about energy. So I developed, and I'm speaking in class tomorrow, there we go, econ class tomorrow, about a concept called a green revolving fund, where we have a way to do energy efficiency with money that we set aside for that purpose. So find what you're good at and turn that skill toward solving the problems that are out there. Third, now I'm going to speak directly to students here. I have a list of 5 things that I tell students that they need to be really careful about, or let me say it differently, ways that you can make a big impact. So right now, David said you're not procreating right now. That's true. But you know what else you're not doing right now is you're probably living in your own house. You're not probably driving a new car, whatever. So here are some decisions that you can make in the very short order. A couple of years from now, you're going to make all these decisions. And I'm going to suggest that you buy the smallest house that you think you can live in. Buy the smallest car you think you can survive in. You live as close as possible to work, school for your kids, church, and the grocery store. You fly as little as possible, and you eat as close as possible to the base of the food chain. Now, of those 5 things, only one students can do right now, and that is eat close to the base of the food chain. So choose less meat, and if you're going to choose less meat, if you have to eat meat, eat poultry instead of beef. I'm seeing head shaking back there. Oh, and that's not me. Okay, if that's not you, then fine. Then buy a small house. Okay, I got a nod there. Love it, love it. We're on the same wavelength. No, I mean those are 5 things that you can do, practical things that you can do in your life that will reduce your carbon footprint, and you are going to be making really important choices about every single one of those things probably in the next couple of years. So just think about that as you live the rest of your life. So hopefully that's getting at a little bit of what that question was asking, because I think they're really important decisions that you each have to make. And okay, now I'm going to say it to everybody, we all have to make, right? Next time you buy a car, buy as efficient one as you possibly can, and as small as you possibly can. When you downsize your house, really downsize it. Okay, move closer to where you need to be, all that kind of stuff. Hopefully that's helpful. Say something?
Yeah, real quick, one thing I'd say, maybe it's the day, but I'd say vote. Vote carefully, vote for people who care about the climate, all right? And, and also for young people, get yourselves in public office as quick as you can, because young people tend to get it. It's their future we're talking about. And so we need good, strong young leaders who understand what's going on and are really focused on changing things. So yeah, vote for old people who think that way, and then get yourself in position so I can vote for you. And,
Now we have time for one more. I saw a hand somewhere over here.
oh,
We just both missed the 4th one.
Oh, could you repeat your
I think it was fly less.
Oh, yes, you're right.
Yeah, don't fly.
Wonderful. So that's not going to count for our last question. So I'll turn it over to you.
I think another part of the big challenge is that so many people on this planet don't want this to be a problem. Like, this book is just bunk. If you read just in Pulp Fiction, and that's Michael Crichton's not a scientist, but he wrote State of Fear about 20 years ago and saying your 800,000 years is way too small. Like you got to think of the billions and billions of years. And, if we're talking about the age of the earth, anything beyond 6,000 could be controversial, but billions and billions of years. And they'll say, well, here's the science on this. And he claims to quote actual real bona fide science in this novel, saying these are fluctuations that have happened every time. And sure, there's disasters, but actually the polar ice caps are thickening. The sea level is not rising. And he's saying, I know it's for the purpose of a book, but I think there's a general wish that we weren't facing environmental disasters, so we deny it. And the system that we're trying to create brings those results, which is planet's in no great jeopardy. There's a bunch of do-gooders out there who are trying to make this a problem, but it's not really a problem. How do we deal with that part of the big challenge? Not that the problem is so big, but the problem doesn't exist at all.
Yeah, so in brief, what do you say to people who don't think this is a problem?
And claim science.
And claim science as their rationale.
Want to go first?
No, you don't.
All right, so the first thing that I would say, so first of all, thank you for the question. That's a really great one. And it's an important one to think about. The first thing I would say is that all hands on deck means we need people who are good communicators and who can describe the science well and do it in a winsome and convincing way. So there are plenty of people out there who are more convincing than David and me with our sciencey graphs. So one person to look up would be Catherine Hayhoe. If you don't know her name, she's a fantastic communicator. So that's, I guess, first thing I would say. The second thing to say is that it's all about communication. And actually, there's a great group of people who are looking at this problem called the Yale something on climate change communication. So Yale University climate change communication people, they study very in depth what works and what doesn't when you're talking to people about environmental issues and especially climate change. So if you take the tact that it's all about communication, then you got to be strategic in understanding what's going to resonate with your audience. All right. So the thing that they find that usually works more than anything else with skeptics is to find a point of connection. I love my kids, you love your kids. I'm really concerned because I love my kids. I'm concerned about what the future is going to be like. Yes, I'm concerned about my kids because what the future is going to be like. One of the things that I'm concerned about in the future is that the environment won't be as robust and in good position as it was for you and me for our own children. So find points of communication and then use that to tell your story. Maybe I'll say one more thing about this too, and this is, again, maybe aimed at students. Maybe some of you are in families where students have been convinced that this is a really big issue and you should be thinking about it and be concerned about it, but your families don't share the same point of view. How do I live in that tension? My counsel to my students is that it's not worth losing any relationships over this. So find a way to still love your parents, find a way to still love your brother and sister, even if they don't agree with you. Because just like fixing the planet's problems can't be done by you, one of the ways that fixing the planet's problems can't be done by you is that you convincing your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister to do what you think is the right thing on the planet. Even if you convince them, it's not going to fix the problem. So don't destroy your relationships over this. And still be in community and family, be kin with your brothers and sisters and parents. And, it's kind of like It's another thing to think about when we talk about Christian discipleship, right? We talk about how we can witness, but we don't actually do the conversion. The conversion comes from the Holy Spirit through, the Holy Spirit doing God's work in the world. And I think it's that way when we talk about climate and environmental things too. We can witness, we can at the appropriate time say, yeah, I'm kind of concerned about that. But maybe it's not our job alone to convince your mom and dad that this is an issue that they should really care about in the same way that you do. Parents and children have disagreements and differences over all kinds of issues. The environment might be just one of them. And don't let that destroy your relationships with your family and friends. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but there's some resources there. The Yale study on climate change communications, I think, a really good one, and some strategies to think about. But then don't let it destroy your friends and your family.
I would say too, you have to sort of count, is it worth the time investment to have a conversation with someone like that, right? And you have to think about how important is that person in your life. And like Matt said, is it worth damaging a relationship that's really important? But one thing that I found helpful in my own interactions with people who think really differently than me is approach it with a line of questioning. I mean, they think the way they think for reasons, and if you can get at some of those reasons, so maybe help me understand why you think that way when so much of science seems to point in another direction. I don't get that. I'd love it if you're right, but boy, what I'm looking at just doesn't add up with that conclusion. Could you help me understand why it is you think that way? And so keep asking questions like that, see how they respond, and have them justify their position and be willing to listen and try to understand their story. Maybe there's something back there that distrust science because that's something that happened in their life or something like that. Again, this is no panacea, but at least it maintains a relationship, right? And you're not cutting them off and you're not showing them that you don't want anything to do with them. You're trying to understand their position and it just doesn't make sense to you. So I think it's worth a try, but sometimes you just have to sort of count your losses and say, we're gonna have to move forward and just agree to disagree. But I still care about you, that kind of thing.
Bit of a hard question to end on. A wonderful conversation. And one of the things that really struck me tonight was the way you said, these are hard realities, but creation care is rooted in joy. It's rooted in a joy of who God is and who God has called us to be and the good creation God has made. You mentioned the hymn, Dave, "This is my Father's world." And so as we close, I just want to read a few of the lines there to celebrate the joyful goodness of God's creation, that he's called us to help flourish, even when things may look difficult. "This is my Father's world. The birds their carols raise, the morning light, the lily white, declare their Maker's praise. This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair. In the rustling grass, I hear him pass. He speaks to me everywhere. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world. Why should my heart be sad? The Lord is king, let heavens ring. God reigns, let earth be glad." That, of course, does not preclude lament, but it does help us end in joy, and a joy that you, Matt and Dave, have helped invite us into as we traverse difficult questions, vexing challenges, but we can do so, as you've reminded us, with the joy and confidence that we are called to faithfulness. So please join me in thanking them once again for a wonderful evening. And after a feast of ideas, we now have a feast of food. There are snacks, delicious goodies right behind the double doors there. And Dave and Matt, I think, will stick around for a little bit to sign books, maybe continue some conversations. And thank you again for coming out. Wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, John.
My kids is 28 and 22.
This gorgeous area, I mean,
And there's a lot, I mean, like, this is, you know, city of waterfalls.